lonely rancher hired her to clean his barn, but when he knocked, he found her raising 4 kids alone. The barn hadn't been open in months, maybe longer. The hinges groaned when Jeb Calloway forced the door back on a morning, so still it felt like even the wind was holding its breath. Dust rose in ribbons through the narrow beams of sunlight, dancing like old ghosts. Jeb stood in the doorway with his hat held to his chest, boots quiet in the hay. The place smelled of dry timber and forgotten time. Cobwebs clung to the rafters like memories he hadn't asked to keep. Tools leaned where he'd left them, silent, rusting, and used. His fingers trailed along a beam, rough and familiar. It wasn't that he couldn't clean the place himself. He still had his strength, though time had thinned it some. But something about sweeping out the barn felt like trying to sweep out the years, like it might unearth things best left buried. The house, too, was too quiet. Always had been since Eliza passed 3 winters back. She'd gone in her sleep, as gentle leaving this world as she'd been living in it. Jeb had kept things going afterward. Fed the stock, mended fence, cooked for one. But there was no laughter anymore. No voice calling from the porch. Just him in the creak of the wood and the long, empty evenings that made the sky feel twice as wide. At the general store, old Mamie had mentioned a woman, widowed or maybe abandoned. Folks couldn't seem to agree. Lived out by the cottonwoods, past the church, and just shy where the prairie dipped toward nothing. Said she'd do laundry or sweeping for a few coins, anything to keep her children fed. 4 of them, someone whispered. Still small. Jeb didn't need a housekeeper. What he needed was, well, maybe he didn't know, just that it wasn't right to live surrounded by dust and silence when life still stirred somewhere nearby. So that's how he came to knock. Her door was barely a door, weather-warped with hung by rust-bitten hinges, patched where it had splintered near the bottom. A child's sweater hung from a nail beside it, missing buttons, the sleeves uneven. He knocked once. The sound echoed too loudly in the stillness. Then again, softer. The door opened with a shiver of old wood. She stood there, backlit by the dim interior. No greeting, not at first. Just her eyes, dark as tilled earth, watchful, wary. She wasn't young, not exactly, but the kind of woman who had been aged more by circumstance than by time. Her dress was plain, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a faint smudge across her cheek. Her hair was pulled back, not for beauty, but to keep it from falling in her work. Behind her, 2 children peeked around her skirts. A third sat by the hearth, curled into a blanket. A 4th, just a babe, rested on her hip, face turned into her mother's neck like it had learned the world was too loud already. Jeb cleared his throat, awkward with the weight of being a stranger. He introduced himself, said he had a barn needed tending. Nothing fancy, just sweeping and wiping down, maybe a few hours' work each week. She didn't nod, didn't smile, just held his gaze like a woman who'd learned not to flinch. Finally, she asked what he'd pay. He told her, not a fortune, but fair. Enough for flour and maybe something extra. She hesitated. He could see her doing the math in her mind. Not just the coins, but the risks. Was he a kind man or the other kind? Would she be safe? With the children? Then the baby stirred against her shoulder, and her oldest, a girl of perhaps 8, let out a soft cough behind her. Clara. He'd learn her name later. Looked down, then back at him. All right, she said, voice dry as gravel but steady. I'll come Thursday. He tipped his hat and turned back toward his horse. That night, he lit the stove and sat at the kitchen table, without really tasting his supper. The lamp hissed quietly beside him. He kept thinking about the shape of her standing in that doorway, how solid she looked, even with the world pressing so hard against her. How she hadn't asked for pity or even help, just fair trade, just a place to start. Thursday came with pale skies and morning chill that hadn't yet burned off. Clara arrived early. She led her children in a slow line down the lane, the youngest bundled and slung over her back in a patched-up sling. The girl held the hand of a younger boy. Another tottered behind, his boots too big. Jeb was already at the barn, sleeves rolled, waiting. He didn't know what he expected. Maybe a quick nod, maybe a brief hello. What he got was silence. Clara handed off the baby to her eldest and walked into the barn like she'd done it 100 times before. No questions, no small talk. She started in the corners, stirring dust into the air, her broom moving like it had rhythm. The children sat outside near the fence. The girls spread a threadbare blanket and unpacked bread and 2 apples. Jeb, watching from a distance, brought out a bucket of well water and a chipped mug. The girl thanked him softly. Inside the barn, Clara moved like she was fighting something invisible. Her arms worked in sharp, determined strokes, as if every fleck of dirt she swept away loosened something in her own chest. He offered her coffee. She shook her head, without looking up, not unkind, just firm, boundary clear. He watched her sometimes, not out of curiosity, but because there was something honest about the way she moved. She didn't waste emotion, didn't sigh or stretch for pity. She just worked, and for a man who'd spent too long in stillness, that quiet movement began to stir something. By the time the sun touched the hills, the barn looked cleaner than it had in years. She stood near the door, wiping her hands on her skirt. Her face was flushed, and a loose strand of hair curled against her temple. She looked younger when she wasn't bracing herself. He handed her the pay, folded neatly in an envelope. She didn't count it, just tucked it into her coat. The children were gathered under the cottonwood tree, chasing each other in slow, tired spirals. The girl called out, and Clara's eyes softened. "You need anything fixed?" she asked quietly, still not quite meeting his eyes. He hesitated, then said, "No, not today." She nodded once. "We'll come next Thursday." He watched them walk away down the long lane. The wind picked up, lifting bits of hair from her collar, spinning the children's laughter into the fading light. The boy trailed behind again, slow but steady. Jeb stayed there a while, leaning against the doorframe. The barn smelled like wood again, not just dust. The air felt different, though he couldn't have said why. He didn't know what this would become, only that something had started. And sometimes that's all it takes. A knock on a quiet door, a woman who says yes, and the wind shifting just a little on the porch. The next Thursday came with a sky wash pale and a wind that bent the grass in long, silent waves. Jeb waited on the porch, hands in his coat pockets, the brim of his hat casting a shadow that made him look more solemn than he felt. The world, once too quiet, now had an undercurrent, a pulse he hadn't known he missed. He saw them before he heard them. Clara walking steady down the lane, children trailing behind like loose threads of her spirit. The boy in boots too big dragged a stick behind him, tracing lines in the dirt. The girl, oldest and already marked by the weight of watching over others, carried the baby bundled in the same worn sling. Clara's dress was patched at the hip and her coat flared with each step, wind tugging at its hem like a reminder that winter hadn't quite given up. She didn't speak when she reached the barn, just nodded, moved past him, and went straight to the corner where she'd left off. Her broom was hers now. She kept it leaned against the wall, like a soldier resting between battles. Jeb offered coffee again. She didn't answer, so he brought it anyway, left it on a crate near the door. Warm, dark, steady, like something that didn't expect gratitude but still hoped for it. Outside, the children played quieter than most. Their laughter, when it came, was light and brief, like something borrowed. They dug in the dirt, shaped nothing into stories, built forts from broken branches. They were good kids. Jeb could tell that without needing to say it aloud. Clara had raised them with dignity, and that was clear in the way they looked out for each other. Inside, the barn was changing. The dust was thinner now. Sunlight came in more boldly through cracks in the wood, catching the shine of clean floorboards and a few neatly stacked tools. Clara worked with a kind of urgency that suggested this wasn't just labor, it was defiance, as if she could sweep away the judgments of a town that had already made up its mind about her. Jeb didn't ask her where the children's father was. He didn't need to know. The absence hung around her like a shawl, worn, heavy, and never quite falling away. Some stories don't need retelling. Some truths make themselves known in the lines of a woman's face and the calluses on her palms. A few weeks passed this way. Thursdays became a rhythm, broomstrokes, children's voices, the quiet scrape of metal on wood. Jeb began fixing small things without telling her. A hinge that squeaked, a board that wobbled. He added hooks near the door for her coat, laid out a fresh bar of soap by the water pump. These weren't favors. They were acknowledgments. She noticed. She never said anything, but her hands lingered once when folding the rag she used to polish the windows, and her eyes softened when she passed in the bucket, without being asked. Then winter came early. It arrived on a wind that howled like an old dog mourning its master. The first frost painted the windows one night, and by morning the town was quiet under a silver glaze. Jeb chopped with more urgency, patched his roof, salted the steps. He thought of Clara that day, of the children in that sagging shack by the cottonwoods. He considered writing out a check on them, but stopped himself. She was proud, independent, and he didn't want to offend her with his worry. When Thursday came, she didn't show. The barn stayed empty. The broom leaned where she'd left it, untouched. Jeb waited through morning, then noon, then dusk. The sun dipped low and the cold deepened. He lit his stove, but the warmth didn't take hold the way it used to. By the second mist Thursday, he saddled his horse. The lane to her home was rutted with frozen mud. Cottonwood leaves lay curled and brown in ditches, forgotten by their trees. He dismounted and walked the rest of the way. The house looked smaller than he remembered, hunched beneath the weight of frost. Smoke curled from the chimney, but thin, barely enough to speak of warmth. He knocked once. Silence. Then footsteps. Slow, deliberate. The door creaked open. Clara stood there, eyes hollow by worry, face pale but upright. The baby was strapped to her chest again, flushed and coughing. Behind her, the girl clutched a blanket to her brother's chest while the littlest sat curled on a pile of quilts, cheeks pink with fever. "She's sick," Clara said. Her voice was quieter than he'd ever heard it. He, too. "Just a cold. They'll be fine." Jeb didn't ask permission. He stepped inside. The warmth was shallow, the kind that hugs the ankles but can't reach the bones. The stove was going, but the pile wood beside it was low. A single kettle rattled on the surface, steam weak and slow. He didn't say much, just looked around, took in the worn bedding, the cracked windows stuffed with fabric, the tin plates stacked neatly on a shelf like soldiers waiting for supper. "I brought stew," he said. He hadn't, but it didn't take much to ride back and fetch it. When he returned later, the children were asleep. Clara sat near the stove, arms wrapped around her knees, hair falling loose around her face. She looked younger then, or maybe just more tired. "Town's got medicine," Jeb said gently. "I can bring some." She didn't answer right away. "They'll be fine," she murmured again. "I can't owe anyone. Not more than I already do." "You don't," he replied. "You work. That's not owing. That's earning." She looked up at him, and for the first time, really met his eyes. There was something in her stare, not gratitude, not yet, but recognition, as if she just realized he wasn't there to rescue her, only to stand near enough that she didn't have to carry it all alone. "I'll come next week," she said, and her voice didn't waver this time. He nodded once, tipped his hat as he left. The next Thursday, she came. This time, the children walked a little lighter. The girl even waved before she disappeared behind the barn to gather dry twigs. Clara worked slower that day, not because she was tired, but because the barn no longer demanded urgency. It was cleaner now, lighter. He brought coffee again. She drank it. For the first time, she spoke about the weather, then about the barn, then one sentence more than she needed. "You fixed the shutter," she said, almost casually. "I meant to ask." He shrugged. "Needed fixing." And then she smiled. Small, brief, but real. It wasn't a new beginning. Not yet, but it was something. Something worth showing up for. And as the children's laughter curled through the afternoon air, Jeb realized he was no longer waiting for silence to end. He was learning to listen to the sound of it being replaced. And that was enough, for now. The frost settled deeper that month, hardening the earth and quieting the hills. The ranch looked more like a painting than a place to live. Fence posts dressed in ice, the roof lines sharp with white. But inside the barn, something had begun to shift, not just in the air, which now smelled faintly of wood polish and hay instead of damp rot. No, something quieter, harder to name. Clara came every Thursday without fail. Her coat was always buttoned tight, a scarf wrapped carefully around her neck. She moved slower now, not from reluctance, but from steadiness, a kind of growing comfort in knowing no one would rush her, no eyes would be waiting to judge. The broom was still hers. So were the rags and the way she folded them with care when the work was done. Jeb had stopped waiting on the porch. He didn't need to anymore. He'd hear the kids before he saw them. The shuffle of boots, a small voice singing half of him, laughter in soft bursts like it wasn't yet sure it was allowed to be loud. He'd open the barn, light the stove, and put the kettle on. Sometimes Clara would nod when she came in. Sometimes not, but she always got to work. He watched less now, not out of disinterest, but out of respect. She didn't need watching. She needed space to remember who she was before life folded her in too many directions. Her children had begun to treat the ranch like something they might belong to. The oldest girl, Mary, he'd learned, gathered twigs without being asked and helped her brothers keep to one corner of the yard. The littlest boy, Sammy, had taken to sitting on the step of the barn, holding a piece of twine like it was a lasso, muttering to himself about cows and coyotes. It made Jeb smile sometimes. Not openly, just enough to feel the weight in his chest shift. One afternoon, the air turned strange, still cold, but with a softness and a wind that hinted spring was out there somewhere, just past the ridge. Clara stayed after her work was finished, warming her hands by the barn stove while her children gathered acorns and feathers by the creek bed. She looked different in firelight, not softened. She was already soft and quiet, enduring way of worn leather and river stones, but open, somehow, unbraced. He handed her a mug of coffee without speaking. She took it this time, without hesitation. Her hands were rough, but clean. She held the mug like it had weight. "I used to like this time of year," she said suddenly, eyes on the flame. "Right before thaw. Felt like a secret, like the earth was about to remember itself." Jeb nodded, unsure whether to speak. He'd learned not to rush her. "My husband hated it," she continued. "Said it made the ground too slick for riding and the roof too heavy with snow." She sipped. Not that it stopped him from riding out anyway. He said nothing, but his shoulders settled in place. He knew this wasn't gossip. This was memory, surfacing where it could breathe. He wasn't cruel. Not at first, she added, and her voice thinned. Just impatient. He didn't take the stillness. Said it made him feel buried alive. Jeb looked at her hands wrapped around the mug. They weren't shaking. "He left during a storm," she said after a pause. "Took the mule and my father's rifle. Said he'd be back by dusk. Never was." A silence followed, but it didn't hang like dead air. It settled like a blanket between them. Jeb nodded again. "My wife passed in the spring," he said quietly. 3 years ago. Fever took her fast. Woke up coughing. By sundown she was gone." Clara didn't speak, but she looked at him, really looked, and he saw in her eyes the same quiet shape of grief. Not fresh, not festering, just woven into the fabric. "I used to hate this time of year," he added. "Felt like the world moving on without asking." She smiled then, just a little. Funny how seasons feel different depending on what you lost. They didn't talk more that day, but when she gathered her children and stepped back into the wind, she left behind something neither of them had named. A little space carved out of silence where something warmer could grow. The following Thursday, she brought bread. It was coarse, a little flat, but warm. She handed it to him without ceremony, and he accepted it without thanks. That was the deal now. No debts, only offerings. He noticed she stood taller these days. The children didn't flinch when strangers passed on the road. Something in all of them had started to root. Not deeply, not yet, but enough. Then the trouble started. It was a Tuesday when Jeb walked into town for feed and flour. The postmaster's wife, always watching, called her by name and nodded toward the saloon porch. A few ranch hands were leaning against the post there, laughing with too much effort. One of them, Deke Halpern, drunk as a hog in a cornfield, smirked when Jeb passed. "Tell me, Calloway," he called, voice thick. "She cleaned your barn the way she cleaned out her last man's saddlebag?" Laughter followed, hard and sharp. Jeb stopped, turned, said nothing, just looked. Deke faltered under that look. Jeb didn't raise his voice, didn't swing a fist, just said, quiet as a creek in thaw, "You got the right to speak, Halpern, but you best hope you got the spine to stand behind it." Then he turned and left. He didn't tell Clara, but Thursday came, and she looked at him different, as if she'd heard, as if word had found its way to her like wind under a door. She didn't mention it. Neither did he, but when she passed in the rag, her fingers brushed his. She didn't pull away. That night, the children sat by the barn stove while Jeb carved a piece of driftwood into a small bird, handing it wordlessly to Sammy, who beamed. Clara watched from the door, not smiling, just full of something steadier than joy, a knowing, a trust. Winter was still thick on the land. The sky was heavy with the promise of one last storm. But beneath it, something had taken root. Not love, not yet, but the kind of companionship that stays through the storm and waits for the bloom. And outside, just past the edge of the pasture, the creek had begun to murmur again, soft, secret, sure. The thaw came late that year, slow and stubborn, as if winter wasn't quite ready to let go. Snow clung to the shadows even as the grass began to peek through in soft green blades. The creek, once quiet beneath its frozen crust, now sang again, low, steady, the sound of land breathing deep after holding still too long. Clara had stopped looking over her shoulder. She still walked with care, still kept her children close, but the tightness that once lived between her shoulders had eased. Her eyes, once vigilant, now carried something else. Not ease. Life never made things that simple. But steadiness. A trust not quickly earned. Jeb noticed a change the way he noticed the first crocus beneath the post oak. Small, almost hidden, but undeniable. She lingered after work now, not just to warm her hands, but to sit on the porch steps with the baby tucked against her side, eyes watching her children tumble through leftover snow. He'd built them a swing. Nothing fancy, just rope and a thick board nailed between two barn beams. But it held, and the sound of laughter in that barn was like hearing him hummed low under the breath of someone who'd long forgotten how to sing. One morning, the sky turned strange. Not storm dark, not yet, but heavy in the way spring skies get when a thaw takes too much at once. The creek rose fast that afternoon, muddy and wild, dragging branches and old bones through its current. By dusk, the rain came. Not gentle, not brief, the kind of rain that hammers against roofs and tests the seams of old things. Jeb sat by the window, watching the curtain of water swallow the lane. His horse paced the fence line, uneasy. He thought of Clara's house, low set and too close to the creek. Thought of the boards he'd meant to help her replace, but hadn't yet. Thought of the baby, the quiet boy, the girl with the steady hands. By the time he reached for his coat, he already knew he was going. The ride was rough, the road more mud than trail. He reached her place near midnight, lantern swinging from his saddle. Water had already crept up the steps. A pale glow flickered behind the window, and when he knocked, it took only a moment for her to open the door. She didn't ask why he'd come, didn't tell him to leave, just looked behind her at the children asleep in a huddle on the floor, and then back at him, eyes wide, mouth a tight line of unspoken worry. "Get your things," he said, voice low. "The wagon's close. We don't wait." She nodded once. He carried two of the children. Clara carried a third, and a sack of what they could grab. Clothes, bread, a worn Bible. Mary walked, holding the lantern high with hands that didn't shake. The creek had nearly breached the path by the time they left. Clara turned once to look back. Her house stood silent in the dark, the door swinging loose. She said nothing, just climbed into the wagon and wrapped her coat tighter around the baby's face. They arrived soaked and shivering. Jeb lit the stove, laid out quilts, brought dry clothes from a cedar chest he hadn't opened in years. No one spoke until the fire crackled full, and the room stopped echoing with storm. Clara sat near the hearth, eyes closed, baby in her lap. The others curled against her. Mary looked up once, at Jeb, and then laid her head down on a folded coat. He slept in the barn that night, not out of obligation, but respect. Come morning, the rain had stopped. The light came in thin and golden, falling across the children's faces like a blessing. Clara stood in the kitchen, hair undone, sleeves rolled. She was making coffee in a pot he hadn't used since before Eliza died. She didn't look out of place. He didn't feel alone. That afternoon, they walked the land together. The creek had pulled branches across the pasture fence. He pointed, and she nodded, and together they cleared what they could. The children helped. They didn't ask to go home. Maybe they already knew. By the end of the week, he cleared the storage room in the barn, laid down rugs, hung 2 lanterns. It wasn't a home, not yet, but it was warm. It was safe. Clara never said she would stay. She didn't have to. Some things speak louder without words. They shared suppers now. Not every night, but enough. The children took the rhythm quickly. Chores and bread making, buckets of water drawn and poured, eggs gathered from the hens. Jeb caught himself watching them sometimes, wondering how easily the empty corners of his life had begun to fill. Not suddenly, just steadily, like spring coming through the frost. One morning, Mary handed him a bundle of kindling without being asked. She smiled when he thanked her. He stood there a moment too long, and when Clara passed by, she reached out and adjusted his collar. Not with meaning, not without it either. A week passed, then another. One evening near twilight, he left a box on the porch. Rough wood, nothing elegant. Inside it, a ring, not gold, but carved from elk horn, sanded smooth, fitted her hand by guess in quiet hope. There was no note, just a ring, and what it meant. She found it after supper. He stood outside, watching the sun fall behind the hills. He heard the door open, then close. She stepped beside him, silent. The sky was streaked with fire. "I never asked for saving," she said at last. He didn't turn to her, just nodded. "I know." She looked down at the ring in her palm, then at him. "I'm not broken," she said. He looked at her then, held her gaze. "I never thought you were." They stood there in the hush that followed. Then she slipped the ring into her pocket and reached for his hand, not to take it, to hold it. The barn behind them glowed with lamplight. Inside, children laughed over supper. Somewhere far off, the creek still moved, quieter now. Spring hadn't just come back. It had knocked, and for once, someone had opened the door. If this story stirred your heart, don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss another tale from the frontier.